Welcome to the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. This is a big week for the economy. Today we have Treasurer Jim Chalmers delivering an economic update to Parliament. And yesterday we saw the inflation data for the June quarter. The Consumer Price Index showed annual inflation at 6.1%, up 1.8% for the quarter. It's slightly lower than expected, but inflation still remains at its highest level in 2 decades. Underlying inflation was the one that jumped. It printed at 4.9% for the year. That's the highest number in about 30 years. Cherelle Murphy is the EY Oceania Chief Economist. Cherelle, welcome back to Fear and Greed.
Thank you, Sean. A pleasure to be here.
You like days like yesterday where you get really big economic numbers out?
Oh, I love it. I love it. It makes the heart beat faster, Sean.
It does. So tell me the Consumer Price Index figures for the June quarter, what did they show?
Well, they showed inflation running at a very strong rate, as we know, 6.1%. So it's just, compared to where we've been in for a very long time, that is off the charts. It wasn't, however, unexpected. So we knew it was coming. The market had expected 6.3%. This was slightly better, but you wouldn't say much better. Lots of things going on. There's supply side issues. There's strong demand in the economy. There's imported inflation. There's lots of different constraints in the economy which are not favorable to prices. So it's a really complicated and messy situation at the moment in terms of prices.
Okay, so if we pick that apart, whereabouts are we seeing some of the biggest rises, or where did we see some of the biggest rises?
So dwelling purchases, that's one that's obviously showing a lot of rising pressures. So everything from, renovating, but also building a house, the cost of materials, the cost of getting a tradie. I'm trying to renovate a bathroom at the moment. I know all about this.
I got a whole house, Cherelle, whole house.
Good luck to you, Sean. You should pause it now, go on a holiday and come back in a few years, I think.
Yeah.
So dwelling purchase costs up 5.6%. Fuel costs, of course, up again, another 4.2%. And furniture actually was very strong this time around as well.
The underlying inflation rate of 4.9%, just explain what it is, what it takes out. And that one did jump quite a bit, didn't it?
That's right. And this tends to be the one the Reserve Bank's really interested in. So the trimmed mean rose by 4.9%. And that sort of means if you take off the very volatile items at the bottom end, so things that fall in price, and the very volatile things at the top end, this gives you, that trimmed measure of the CPI. At 4.9%, of course, well and truly above the Reserve Bank's 2 to 3% range, pretty uncomfortable.
Okay. So often on Fear and Greed, our guests talk about wage growth and pressure on wages to rise and real wage increases. And we've heard a lot about that in politics as well. Are we comparing a wage increase, such as the Fair Work Commission gave in the last couple of months of 5.1%, are we comparing that to the trimmed mean, the underlying rate, or the absolute rate?
Well, it would be the absolute rate because we need to consider all price rises when you're thinking about wages. So you can't just cut off petrol prices because they rise a lot and say, well, that doesn't matter. Of course it matters. And it's particularly interesting at the moment because a lot of the things that are essential purchases are the things that are going up the most quickly. So essential goods and services, the prices of those rose by 7.6% through the year, whereas the more discretionary goods and services only rose by 4%. So it's really squeezing the budgets of households and particularly low-income earners because it's the kind of things you can't avoid. It's the cost of petrol for getting to work. It's the cost of food, cost of groceries, cost of electricity. Those are the things that are really racing ahead. And in some ways that makes the CPI number actually look even worse. And I think it's going to be important to the outlook going forward because if households are feeling that pressure from the necessities, then they really are going to start changing their behavior, pulling back on some of the luxury little goods and services that they like. And that's, of course, the kind of thing that slows the economy down.
So, yeah, and then on top of that, you put interest rate rises. We've already had 3 of those, and most market economists expect another 50 basis points next week. Certainly bond markets are suggesting that the cash rate will get much, much higher by this time next year. All those things, that's kind of doing their job, though, isn't it? Trying to slow things down.
That's right. And look, the Reserve Bank is not trying to fix interest rates to affect inflation today. It's really trying to affect inflation in 12 months' time. Now, that doesn't feel great when you're a consumer. You think, well, that means there's a lot to go. But essentially, if they get it done now, if they get the job done now and slow the economy at this point in time, then we'll face lower rates into the future. And that's probably the best possible outcome that we can hope for.
Stay with me, Cherelle. We'll be back in a minute. I'm speaking to Cherelle Murphy, EY Oceania Chief Economist. The one thing that I have noticed is we had figures out from New Zealand last week which were on inflation, which were extremely high. Same for the UK, same for the US. Australia doesn't seem to be doing quite as poorly in terms of price rises as those economies. Why?
That's right. It isn't quite as bad. I guess there's a number of reasons. Perhaps our economy isn't running quite as hot as some of those economies, and that, the demand side might not be as strong. There are, I guess, certain supply side constraints which are just simply different country to country. It's hard to sort of necessarily unpick those, but essentially there are a lot of things that are in common, and I'd suggest at the moment that those in common are perhaps more than those that are separate. And so hence we're kind of seeing this very strong pickup in inflation because all of these economies have had lots of stimulus put into them over the last 2 years to protect them from COVID, both monetary stimulus from low rates and fiscal stimulus. So perhaps a bit of a combination of all of that, but I think we've probably got more in common than we have that's different.
Okay, so you mentioned fiscal stimulus. We have Jim Chalmers coming out today, and we'll wait and see what he says about the state of the economy. It's basically a budget update. It does seem, though, that fiscal policy has been very generous or loose in recent times, and the government will have to, at some point, start repaying all that debt, won't it?
Yes, I would agree with you there. Fiscal policy is loose at the moment, particularly for an economy that's running as hot as has been post-COVID lockdowns. It's not just the Commonwealth government, it's also the states. When you look at the spending that's been going on there, particularly in the public infrastructure space, it's really high. In fact, when you add up both government consumption and government investment, it's running at about 27% of GDP at the moment, which is suggesting that more than one in every $4 that's being spent in the economy is by the government sector. So that puts a whole new perspective on it. It does show that the government is actually probably contributing to some extent to this price growth. So ideally, I guess we'd pull that back a bit. And I think that the Commonwealth government would really like to do that. I think they really would like to pull spending back for that reason. And also because, as you say, there's quite a lot of debt out there, particularly compared to the recent past. However, it's not easy. When you look at what's been happening in the economy in the last 4 months, the government's had to spend more on flood relief. It's had to spend more on interest rate repayments because rates have been going up. It's had to spend money on COVID-related hospital and health funding. It's had to spend more on things like emergency payments. The COVID emergency payments had to be extended. So it's a really difficult balancing act, I think, for the government at the moment. Lots of things to spend money on, and it's quite hard to pull back spending at the moment.
How does this play out in 12 months, 2 years' time, assuming that rates do keep rising, which most market economists think will happen, and certainly bond markets are suggesting that? What happens?
So the higher rates, which could be as much as 2 percentage points higher quite easily by the end of the year if markets are correct, will, of course, eat into household budgets. So households will have less money to spend on the luxuries. It will increase the cost of doing business for the business sector. So credit growth will probably slow in the business side. Relative to where the currency is, you would expect it to actually lift the currency a little bit. So that means that you're essentially slowing the economy down that way a little bit as well. And also just the kind of pure announcement effect, the sentiment impact of higher rates would actually cause businesses and consumers to rethink how much growth there is coming forward, how likely they are to hold on to a job, how likely they are to find new customers, that sort of thing. So you put all those things together and you should see an economy that actually slows down and therefore inflation pressures which dissipate as well. Having said all that, there's obviously things that the Reserve Bank can't do anything about. So it's really hard for them to control, for example, the cost of transport when you have a flood, or the cost of petrol when there's an international war going on. All these things are outside their control. So they can only do so much. And they're well aware of that, of course, too.
And they can't control government spending either, of course.
No, indeed, that's right.
Cherelle, thank you for talking to Fear and Greed.
My pleasure.
That was Cherelle Murphy, EY Oceania Chief Economist. This is a Fear and Greed Daily interview. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, Australia's most popular business podcast. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.